The air in the executive corridor was cold, but not from the temperature. It was the kind of cold that came from being unwelcome, unseen, unwanted. The glossy white floors of Carter Dynamics gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a perfect mirror for the company's surface-level polish. Beneath that shine, however, lurked a culture Alyssa Carter had only heard whispers about. She had stepped into that world not as the poised and polished executive daughter of the legendary Raymond Carter, but as Jamie, a temporary night cleaner. Her uniform hung awkwardly on her frame, her natural curls tucked beneath a cheap headscarf, and the once confident woman who had given keynote speeches now pushed a mop with blistered hands. No one looked her in the eye, no one cared who she was, and that for the first time was exactly the point. It didn't take long for the mask of civility to drop. Just 20 minutes into her first solo assignment, the humiliation arrived in the form of Ethan Clark, the operations manager. A man with sharp cheekbones, slicked-back hair, and a constant look of disdain etched across his face. Ethan strolled into the room like he owned it. Alyssa, mopping the already clean floor of the executive break room, glanced up only briefly. She had been over this floor 3 times already, every corner, every stain, every invisible spot. But that didn't matter. Not to Ethan. His voice, a low and controlled hiss, cut through the silence like a blade. "Don't you ever talk back to me. You are nothing here. Nothing clean. This room now, or don't bother coming back tomorrow." Alyssa didn't flinch, though her stomach turned. She kept her posture, neutral voice steady. "Sir, the floors are clean. I've done them 3 times." That was all she managed before Ethan, without a word of warning, picked up a full cup of water from the countertop and with surgical cruelty poured it over her head. The icy stream drenched her hair, soaked through the fabric of her uniform, and puddled around her sneakers on the floor she had just finished. The cold water made her gasp, but it wasn't the temperature that left her breathless. It was the pure, calculated disrespect. Ethan looked down at her with a smirk and delivered his final blow. "Now you have something real to clean up." Then he turned and walked out. No apology, no hesitation, just the echo of his leather soles fading down the hallway. Alyssa stood frozen for a long moment, her soaked uniform clinging to her skin, water dripping from her eyelashes. Her mind raced not with rage or shock, but with an eerie clarity. This wasn't an unfortunate incident. It was a test, a real glimpse into the world her father's empire had become. A place where titles meant everything and humanity meant nothing. Where someone like Ethan, empowered by years of unchecked authority, could humiliate another human being without flinching and expect no consequences. Her first instinct was to drop the mop march into her father's office and end Ethan's career with a single sentence. But she didn't, because that wasn't the mission. Not yet. This was why she was here. Her father, Raymond Carter, had built Carter Dynamics from a basement startup into a $6 billion tech leader, one of the few black-led firms in the valley. But his health had begun to decline. His heart attack 6 months earlier had shaken the entire company. It was time for a succession plan, and Alyssa, with degrees from MIT and Stanford, had always been the obvious heir. But her father had one condition before passing her the reins. You can't lead what you don't understand. She needed to see the truth from the ground floor, and tonight that truth had thrown a bucket of ice water on her dreams of a smooth transition. She would finish her shift, she would clean the spill, and she would remember every second of it as she knelt back down and began drying the floor again. Alyssa Carter made a silent vow. She wouldn't forget this moment. She wouldn't let Ethan Clark's smirk go unanswered. And more importantly, she wouldn't allow Carter Dynamics to remain a place where this kind of treatment was routine. For the first time, the disguise didn't just feel like an act. It felt like a mirror showing her the company not as an executive, but as a human being without power. She understood then this undercover mission wasn't about proving she was ready to lead. It was about earning the right to. And Ethan had just made her more ready than ever. The view from the hilltop estate was breathtaking. Sleek city lights stretching across the skyline, each flicker a reminder of the empire that Raymond Carter had built from nothing. At 62, the tech pioneer sat at the head of his long oak dining table. His salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed his posture, still commanding, despite the toll of recent health scares. The Carter family home was elegant but unpretentious, much like the man himself. That night, however, there was a weight in Raymond's voice that even the quiet jazz humming from the speakers couldn't smooth out. Alyssa noticed it the moment he set down his fork and folded his hands, gazing at her, not just as his daughter, but as the future of Carter dynamics. "It's time we had a real conversation," he said, his eyes sharper than usual, filled with something deeper than pride, concern. Alyssa, fresh from leading a successful rollout of a green tech initiative in Austin, raised a curious eyebrow. She had always been ambitious, always expected to one day take the reins. After earning her MBA at Stanford and managing 2 major divisions within the company, she'd checked every box a board could ask for, but her father had never been one for checklists. He was a man of experience, intuition, and legacy. "You've excelled in every way," he said. "You're smart, prepared, and confident. But that's not what worries me." His voice softened, but there was a firmness behind it. "What worries me, Alyssa, is that you don't know this company. Not really. You know the numbers, the vision, the executive suite, but you've never seen what it's like down in the trenches." The room fell silent, the clink of her wine glass. The only sound, Alyssa leaned back, slightly unsure whether to feel defensive or intrigued. "You think I don't know my own company?" she asked. More surprised than offended, Raymond nodded slowly. "I think you know the company it pretends to be, the one we put on posters and in press releases. But I started this company as a one-man operation. I was the janitor, the coder, the salesman, the customer service rep. I knew what it meant to clean the floors, take out the trash, and then present to investors in the same hour. That gave me perspective. That's what shaped the company's soul. I don't want you to inherit a title. I want you to inherit that same depth of understanding." He reached into the drawer beside him and pulled out a weathered black and white photo. Raymond, at 27, crouched in a garage surrounded by wires, circuit boards, and empty coffee cups. "This is where it began," he said quietly. "Back when nobody returned my calls, and banks laughed at my loan applications, that man built this company with his hands." Alyssa looked at the photo, her fingers tracing the edges. "Then tell me," she said finally, her voice steady. "How do I earn that understanding?" A spark lit in Raymond's eyes. "By doing what no one expects you to do. Disappear. Go undercover. See how your people are treated when no one's watching. You won't learn culture through reports or quarterly reviews. You'll learn it by mopping floors at 2 a.m. and being invisible." The proposal was audacious even for Raymond, but the moment it landed in the room, something inside Alyssa shifted. It wasn't resistance, it was resolve. She had spent her whole life in boardrooms, conferences, and pitch decks, but she'd never been anonymous, never been dismissed, never been anyone but the boss's daughter. The thought of giving that up, even temporarily, was terrifying, but necessary. "All right," she said, meeting his gaze, "I'll do it. Not for the board, not even for the succession. I'll do it, because if I'm going to lead this company, I need to know who we really are when no one's watching." Raymond smiled, not with relief, but with a quiet sense of affirmation. He knew the test wouldn't be easy, but if anyone could rise to the challenge, it was Alyssa. They spent the next week crafting the plan. A new identity, a third-party janitorial agency for plausible placement, and a complete transformation of her appearance. No fingerprints would link Jamie the cleaner to Alyssa Carter. She would start from scratch just like he had. What neither of them expected, though, was how deeply the experience would scar her and shape her. As Raymond watched her gather her things that night to prepare for the weeks ahead, he felt the familiar ache of fatherhood, pride, fear, and the deep hope that his daughter would come back, not just as the next CEO, but as the kind of leader who could carry the weight of his legacy. And as Alyssa stepped out into the cool night, she wasn't thinking about titles, stock prices, or shareholder calls. She was thinking about silence power and whether she was ready to be unseen for the very first time. The transformation began in the most unlikely of places, a small windowless back room in a modest apartment on the other side of town. The kind of place that no one would associate with Alyssa Carter, Executive Vice President of Carter Dynamics, daughter of tech visionary Raymond Carter. Gone were the tailored suits and custom heels, the manicured nails and carefully chosen lipstick. The woman staring back at her in the dusty mirror had unpressed hair tucked beneath a generic navy headscarf, glasses too large for her face, and a uniform that hung heavy with bleach stains and wear. She wasn't Alyssa anymore. She was Jamie Monroe, a night cleaner, with a paper-thin resume and no LinkedIn profile, and no one, not the front desk, not HR, not even the janitorial manager had any reason to believe otherwise. Her father had insisted on one non-negotiable absolute anonymity, so the plan was crafted with surgical precision. Jamie Monroe's employment file came through Pinnacle Solutions, a third-party cleaning service that contracted night crews to Carter Dynamics' various properties. Raymond had personally coordinated with the agency's owner, an old friend from his earliest startup days. Everything had to appear authentic. Jamie had cleaned 3 other buildings over the past 6 months, all of which had HR contact numbers ready to vouch for her work ethic. The ID badge she was issued was real scanned into the system and valid. Her background check returned clean. As far as anyone knew, Jamie was just another faceless cog in the after-hours machine. The changes were more than cosmetic. Alyssa had to unlearn everything that made her visible in the corporate world. Her posture shifted, shoulders slightly hunched, avoiding direct eye contact. Her stride slowed, her voice softened, sometimes barely above a whisper. She removed her signature scent, the subtle floral perfume that executives unconsciously associated with authority. She ditched her smartwatch and replaced it with a plain rubber wristband. Her phone, once loaded with encrypted company files, now contained nothing but a cleaning schedule, a silent alarm, and emergency contacts listed under fake names. Every part of her had to blend in, disappear. The success of the mission depended on it. What surprised her most was how quickly the invisibility settled in. The moment she stepped into the break room for orientation, no one asked her name, no one welcomed her. The supervisor tossed her a ring of keys, muttered a few safety protocols, and moved on. That was it. No company overview, no team building, no acknowledgement. She was instructed to follow a laminated checklist on the wall and to keep quiet unless spoken to. Within 15 minutes, Alyssa now. Jamie had become part of the furniture background noise unseen. And yet even in those first few hours she began to see the cracks beneath the company's glossy image. The break room was outdated, cluttered with leftover food and passive-aggressive notes taped to the fridge. The cleaning closet was disorganized, stocked with diluted supplies and broken mops. There were no wellness posters here, no core values pinned up like they were on the executive floor, just tired people and fluorescent lights. Her first night shift was brutal. The repetitive physical strain, the chemical smells, the stiffness in her back. Her hands, once soft from years of office work, already felt raw from scrubbing baseboards and lifting heavy bins. But more than the physical challenge, it was the psychological shift that struck her. No one cared who she was, and that was the point. By the time her second night arrived, Jamie Monroe was no longer a role. She was a reality. Alyssa had crossed a threshold, and there was no turning back. Each step into the building, as Jamie felt like walking into another world, one she had always been adjacent to, but never truly seen. As she pushed her cleaning cart through the lobby of the company her family built, she caught her own reflection in the glass. It didn't look like a disguise anymore. It looked like a mirror into a version of herself she'd never known. This wasn't just about corporate insight. This was about empathy, about humanity. And as she stepped onto the elevator bound for the 40th floor, Alyssa Carter, under the name Jamie, braced herself for the real lessons that would come, not from the boardroom, but from the broom closet. The first lesson Alyssa Carter learned as Jamie Monroe was this: invisibility wasn't always a choice. It was a role others forced upon you. On her third night cleaning the executive floors of Carter Dynamics, she began to notice the subtle choreography of neglect. Doors opened and closed without greeting. Conversations carried on uninterrupted, even as she emptied bins beside expensive desks. People, well-dressed, high-ranking people, brushed past her without so much as a glance. It didn't matter that she was sweeping just inches away. She was part of the scenery now, as ordinary and overlooked as the light fixtures above, and for the first time in her life, Alyssa wasn't being watched, evaluated, or even acknowledged. She had become a ghost in the glass and steel temple her family had built. At first, she thought she might be exaggerating the pattern. Perhaps people were just busy. Maybe it was a coincidence that no one returned her smile, or that the elevator doors always closed before she could step in. But the signs multiplied with each passing shift. Executives talked openly about budget decisions, layoffs, and internal conflicts with her standing just feet away. Some even laughed about outsourcing low-level roles while she quietly mopped the floor beneath their polished loafers. One woman, deep in a loud phone call about marketing strategy, stepped around Alyssa's cart without even pausing to let her pass, causing the bin of cleaning cloths to tumble onto the floor. She didn't stop. She didn't apologize. She didn't even look back. Alyssa knelt to pick up the scattered supplies, the echo of stilettos clicking down the hallway, ringing louder than the silence they left behind. It wasn't just a lack of kindness, it was structural erasure. In break rooms, the janitorial staff used different mugs stored on a separate shelf. Their locker room had no working fan, and the vending machine always ate bills but never returned change. There were no Wellness Wednesdays or inspirational quotes tacked to their walls, no catered lunches, no team shout-outs. The corporate culture that Alyssa had proudly helped shape seemed to end somewhere around the 30th floor. Below that, a different ecosystem thrived, one where workers were essential but uncelebrated. She overheard one senior analyst mutter, "They're lucky to have a job at all," when someone mentioned janitors. That phrase stuck in her chest like a nail. Lucky to have a job. These people were the only reason the company didn't literally smell like garbage every morning. Every now and then, someone broke the pattern. A middle-aged software engineer named Luis once nodded politely as he passed her in the hall, and a quiet intern once held the door open with a soft smile. But those moments were rare, so rare they felt like kindnesses instead of basic decency. Alyssa began to understand what her father had meant when he said reports don't reveal culture. No spreadsheet could have shown her the subtle hierarchy of value placed on human beings inside the walls of Carter Dynamics. She remembered approving HR policies about inclusion and respect, nodding along in boardrooms without ever realizing how far those ideals failed to reach. And still, she worked. She cleaned bathrooms and microwaves, scrubbed baseboards, and vacuumed behind couches no one ever sat on, and every night her body ached in new places. But what stung more was the weight of being unseen. Alyssa had spent her life commanding rooms. Now she was barely acknowledged as present in them. She started keeping a mental list of moments that revealed the truth, the time a senior manager dumped coffee grounds into a bin she had just emptied, the meeting that went on for 30 minutes while she cleaned quietly in the background, not once acknowledged, the security guard who barked at her for using the front entrance because vendors should use the service dock. Each one chipped away at the myth of equality the company liked to display on brochures and websites. By the end of her first week, Alyssa had stopped reacting. She no longer flinched when someone bumped her cart or acted as if she weren't there. She had learned how to make herself smaller, how to move without being noticed. But in that smallness, she saw something massive, an entire ecosystem of people who held the company up from underneath, and none of them were being seen. Carter Dynamics, she realized, had two realities. The one that existed in PowerPoint presentations and the one that played out after hours in narrow corridors with flickering lights. And it was in those unseen spaces where toilets were scrubbed, papers shredded, and lives quietly endured that she saw the truth. The company didn't need a visionary leader with new strategies. It needed a reckoning, and Jamie, the invisible cleaner, was going to be the one to start it. By the start of her second week, Alyssa, still known only as Jamie, had grown used to being invisible, but what she wasn't prepared for was becoming a target. The man at the center of that shift was Ethan Clark, the operations supervisor of the executive floors. Ethan was the kind of manager whose authority came not from leadership but from intimidation. His voice didn't need to rise. His presence alone was enough to command fear. Neatly pressed dress shirts, an ever-present leather folder tucked under one arm, and shoes polished to a mirror finish, he walked the halls like a corporate executioner. And while to the executives, he was efficient and results-driven to the janitorial staff. Ethan Clark was nothing short of a tyrant. It began subtly on Jamie's fourth night. Ethan stopped her during her shift to inspect her cart. "Your supplies aren't arranged properly," he said without looking at her. "This is unacceptable." She'd followed the standard layout to the letter, but that didn't matter. The next day it was her mopping pattern too slow. Then it was her vacuuming too loud. One night, she arrived to find her cleaning schedule mysteriously doubled. When she asked another worker, they whispered that Ethan had reassigned her because new people need to learn fast. The real reason was clear. Ethan had zeroed in on her. Whether it was her presence, her posture, or the tiny flicker of defiance she couldn't completely bury, he had decided she was a threat, and he would break her down. One criticism at a time, Ethan's management style wasn't about outcomes, it was about control. He held surprise inspections at 1 a.m., pointing out smudges on glass that required a flashlight to even notice. He once made the crew re-clean an entire wing because a single ceiling vent was dusty, despite it being on the quarterly deep clean schedule, not nightly maintenance. But it wasn't just the excessive standards, it was the way he delivered them all. Calculated each word, designed to remind his team of their place. "You people need to understand," he once barked during a walkthrough. "Carter Dynamics represents excellence, and right now you're dragging that name through the mud." That sentence played on loop in Alyssa's mind, not because it was absurd, but because no one dared push back. While Ethan was harsh with the entire cleaning crew, he seemed to take a special satisfaction in tormenting Jamie. He would stand just close enough to make her uncomfortable, watching her mop like a drill sergeant waiting for her to fail. "Do you even know what you're doing?" he asked one night, interrupting her in the middle of scrubbing the executive restroom floors. "Because I've seen middle schoolers clean better than this." Alyssa wanted to look up to meet his eyes and remind him exactly who he was talking to, but she didn't. Instead, she lowered her gaze and replied quietly, "Yes, sir, I'll do better." The words felt like acid on her tongue, but she swallowed them just as the others had learned to do. The other cleaners, seasoned and silent, had long since developed strategies for surviving Ethan Clark. Darnell, a veteran with kind eyes and sore knees, pulled her aside one night after a particularly brutal encounter. "Stay out of his way," he warned gently. "He gets off on it, making you feel small. Just do the job, don't ask questions, and never look like you're thinking too hard." Alyssa thanked him, then returned to her cart. Her fists clenched so tight she could feel her nails dig into her palms. She wasn't just learning about workplace culture anymore. She was living through a masterclass in emotional manipulation and unchecked authority. And Ethan, with his rigid routines and ruthless perfectionism, was her instructor. But even as he pushed her to the edge, Alyssa began to push back in her own quiet way. She started documenting everything: his language, his behavior, the times, the dates. She memorized his routines, anticipated his inspections, and prepared with surgical precision. If he wanted to play chess, she would match him, move for move. Not out of spite, but out of a growing sense that this wasn't just about her. It was about every cleaner who had been forced to stay late without pay, every woman who had been spoken down to, every moment of silence that had been mistaken for compliance. Alyssa Carter was still undercover, but she was no longer just observing. She was building a case. And Ethan Clark, despite all his arrogance, was giving her everything she needed to take him down. It was just past 11:30 p.m. when the hallway outside the main conference room on the 42nd floor fell into a hush. The offices had emptied out hours earlier, leaving behind the quiet hum of overhead lights and the distant sound of a vacuum. 2 rooms down, Alyssa still cloaked in her identity as Jamie was refilling her mop bucket when she heard it. The unmistakable echo of Ethan Clark's footsteps. The crisp strike of leather shoes on marble flooring had become a kind of warning signal to the night staff, a call to disappear into corners and behind closed doors. But tonight, Alyssa didn't move. She kept her focus on the task, heart-pounding mind, bracing for whatever storm was about to hit. And sure enough, it arrived, cold, calculated, and without a trace of conscience. Ethan approached her cart, surveying the gleaming floor she had spent the last hour perfecting. Without a word, without even pretending to inspect her work, he swung his arm out with sudden force. The cart jolted violently, crashing onto its side, sending supplies flying in every direction. Bottles clattered, rags scattered, the waste bin tipped. It was chaos, and then he stepped through it. Deliberately, slowly, his polished shoes smeared the wet cleaner across the tile in streaks. Each step desecrated the labor she had just poured herself into. Alyssa stood frozen, watching him walk away, expression unreadable. He didn't look back. He didn't offer a word, not of explanation, not of apology, not even mockery, because in his mind this wasn't a moment worth remarking on. She wasn't worth remarking on, but the worst wasn't over. 10 minutes later, Ethan returned. His tone was casual, even amused, as if he were rejoining a scene from a play. Only he knew the script too. Alyssa had just begun resetting the cart, her hands trembling as she tried to salvage the mess. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, stepping into her space. His voice dropped a low growl that only she could hear. Then, with disturbing calmness, he picked up a full cup of water from the nearby table and poured it directly over her head. The liquid soaked through her scarf, clung to her face, dripped into her shirt and shoes. It was deliberate, theatrical, and humiliating. "Now you have something real to clean up," he whispered, dropping the empty cup on the floor with a soft clink. Then he smiled, turned, and vanished down the hallway like nothing had happened. Alyssa didn't cry, not at first. Instead, she stood there dripping and silent, the water pooling around her sneakers, the echo of Ethan's footsteps fading like some terrible drumbeat in the distance. She knelt to the floor again and began wiping the mess. But this time, something inside her had changed. The weight of what had just happened pressed against her chest, not because of how it made her feel, but because of what it revealed. This wasn't just workplace cruelty, it was abuse of power in its rawest form. Ethan knew she couldn't fight back. He knew she wouldn't report him. He counted on her silence, and for years it had worked. She wasn't the first. But Alyssa Carter, though cloaked in janitor's clothes, would be the last. In that puddle of water, beneath the flicker of overhead lights, Alyssa saw every cleaner who'd ever had to laugh off mistreatment, every woman who had been told to stay quiet, every man who'd worked extra hours for no extra pay, too afraid to say no. She saw her father 35 years earlier sweeping out a warehouse with the same dignity that Ethan had just trampled, and she realized then that her mission was no longer just about understanding the company. It was about fighting for it, for the soul of it, not the company that showed up in magazines, but the one that lived and breathed in these quiet, forgotten corridors. That night, as she changed into dry clothes in a downtown diner restroom before heading home, Alyssa didn't feel broken. She felt sharpened. The humiliation hadn't crushed her. It had clarified her purpose. She wasn't here to check a box in her father's succession plan. She was here to build something better. She would not rise to the top and pull the ladder up behind her. No. She would rise and dismantle every rung that kept good people beneath their potential. Ethan Clark had tried to reduce her to nothing. Instead, he gave her something unshakable, a reason, and that reason would soon become his downfall. If Ethan Clark had been a storm, violent, cruel, and unrelenting, then Derek Simmons was the quiet rot beneath polished floors. The marketing director at Carter Dynamics. Derek wasn't loud or brash. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he didn't need to. His cruelty wore a tailored suit and smiled. In the boardroom, he was praised for his creativity, for his campaigns that redefined engagement. But behind closed doors, particularly after hours, his behavior toward cleaning staff told a different story. On paper, Derek's office was a standard 20-minute cleaning assignment. In reality, for Alyssa, still undercover as Jamie, it became a 3-hour psychological gauntlet, repeated night after night. It started innocently enough. On her 6th night, she entered Derek's office just after 10:00 p.m. He was still at his desk, typing with one hand while sipping coffee with the other. He didn't glance up. "Good?" he muttered, eyes glued to his screen. "This place is a disaster. Had a brainstorm earlier. Coffee crumbs. Chaos. Do your thing." Alyssa surveyed the space. It was immaculate. A few papers on the desk, a coffee cup on the side table, but nothing unusual. Still, she got to work. 10 minutes in, he began offering feedback. "You're leaving streaks on the glass table," he said, standing abruptly. "Circular motions. You're using straight lines. That's why you're missing spots." She nodded silently, adjusted her technique and continued, but as she cleaned, his observations grew stranger. "You didn't wipe the underside of the chair legs," he said flatly. "Dust settles everywhere. Try again." That night, Alyssa cleaned Derek's office twice. The second round wasn't because of any real issue. It was performance theater. Derek followed her with exaggerated movements, running his fingers along surfaces, holding them up to the light. "Still dusty," he'd say, even when the cloths came back clean. "Are you even trained?" he asked once, shaking his head with mock disappointment. On the third night, he escalated. As soon as she entered, he pointed to the carpet. "Lint," he said, "you'll need to vacuum again. And don't forget the picture frames. Last time I had to dust them myself. This time, get it right." Alyssa complied, all while documenting everything. His tone, his language, even the fingerprints he'd plant on the glass himself between cleanings. Soon she realized this wasn't about the cleanliness, it was about dominance. Derek needed someone to make feel smaller. He would knock over his own coffee cups just as she finished vacuuming. He'd leave paper clips scattered on the floor after she had tidied the desk. Then he'd sigh dramatically. "You know, if this keeps up, I'm going to have to request someone else," he'd say, never looking her in the eye. His insults weren't shouted. They were delivered with a calm, condescending finality that left no room for rebuttal. "Maybe this just isn't the kind of work for you," he once offered, as if it were advice and not humiliation. Alyssa bit her tongue every time, replying only with a quiet, "Yes, sir." This repeated harassment began revealing something broader to Alyssa, a pattern embedded into the culture of Carter dynamics. Derek wasn't the exception, he was the product, a man who had learned that status gave him immunity, that kindness was optional, and that the invisible labor around him existed only to serve. The systems in place didn't just tolerate his behavior, they enabled it. No one questioned why he needed a cleaner to spend 3 hours in an already tidy office. No one noticed or cared that the janitorial schedule bent entirely around his whims. And worse, some seemed to admire his attention to detail, a term thrown around in executive meetings without ever exploring what that detail cost. Each night as she left Derek's office, well past her scheduled time, Alyssa's body ached, but it was her spirit that felt bruised. His behavior was more insidious than Ethan's rage, but just as corrosive, and it spoke to a company that had stopped seeing people and had started seeing roles, tasks, titles. Carter Dynamics, for all its innovation and forward-facing PR, had allowed its internal ecosystem to grow toxic from the top down. Derek was a mirror to that rot polished on the surface, decaying underneath. And as Alyssa documented each interaction, she knew this wasn't just about one man's abuse, it was about a system that praised results and ignored how they were achieved. By the end of her second week, undercover, Alyssa Carter, still living behind the uniform of Jamie Monroe, had enough bruises, both physical and emotional, to fill a ledger. But the water, the ridicule, the long hours of re-cleaning Derek Simmons' pristine office had all been tolerable in a way, because she had a mission, because she was collecting evidence, because she had a finish line. But there was one line she had to test. Not to find more abuse, but to find accountability. If Carter Dynamics really stood for dignity, then its human resources department, led by the warm, smiling, self-branded ally Karen Monroe, should be the place where that dignity was protected, Or at least, that's what the posters around the building promised. Talk to Karen. Your voice matters. Alyssa decided it was time to find out if that was true. She waited until lunch break the next day after one of the longest nights she'd endured. Her cheeks still felt warm where Ethan's cold water had poured down, and her lower back ached from lifting the mop bucket Derek had conveniently forgotten to empty. Dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans, still posing as Jamie, she walked past the gleaming conference rooms and into HR's corner suite. Karen's office was just as curated as her reputation. Soft lighting motivational quotes framed neatly on the wall, a coffee station offering 3 types of creamer, and a small rainbow flag beside a sign that read, "This is a safe space." Karen herself stood to greet her all business casual charm and practiced warmth. "Hi there, we haven't met, have we? Are you new on the cleaning staff?" Alyssa nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Jamie. I'd like to report something if that's okay." Karen's expression shifted slightly, still pleasant but more cautious now. She gestured to the chair. "Of course. Tell me what happened." Alyssa recounted everything, how Ethan Clark had humiliated her publicly, how he poured water on her, sabotaged her work, and used his power to belittle and intimidate. She spoke clearly, calmly, with just enough vulnerability to be believed, but enough composure to appear credible. She detailed Derek's nightly manipulations, the unreasonable demands, the emotional wear and tear that seemed intentional. Through it all, Karen listened, nodding occasionally, her eyes narrowing as if concerned, but Alyssa was watching closely, her phone recording quietly from her jacket pocket, and she could see it in Karen's body language, the slow retreat behind professional detachment. When Alyssa finished, Karen leaned forward, slightly resting her elbows on her desk. "First of all, thank you for coming in." She began, her voice measured, polished. "It's not easy to speak up, especially in new roles, but then came the pivot that said, I think there might be a bit of misunderstanding here." Alyssa tilted her head, feigning confusion. Karen continued, "You see, roles like yours, support staff operate under very different expectations. Managers like Ethan are under enormous pressure to meet standards, and sometimes their tone can come off firm." She smiled gently, as though offering a helpful reframe. "It's important to remember your place in the structure of the company. Everyone has a role. Some people lead, some people support. That doesn't mean one is less important. It's just different." The message was clear, even beneath the corporate pleasantries. Alyssa didn't count. She wasn't being abused. She was being managed. Karen's next words were the final confirmation I'd suggest focusing on your work and not taking things personally. "You're not the first cleaner to find the pace here demanding, but with time you'll adjust." Alyssa nodded slowly, thanked her for the time, and left the office. As the door closed behind her, the safe space sign mocked her in silence, but she didn't feel defeated. She felt validated, because now she had the proof, not just of abuse, but of complicity. Karen Monroe, the smiling face of corporate empathy, wasn't protecting employees. She was protecting power. Later that evening, Alyssa reviewed the audio. Karen's voice was smooth, practiced, exactly the kind that could reassure a board or charm a compliance officer. But the words were unmistakable. In a company that prided itself on culture and inclusion, HR had become a shield for the privileged and a wall for the powerless. There was no room for people like Jamie Monroe to be heard, only silenced. And the department that should have been a safety net had instead become a polished trapdoor, one designed not to catch people, but to dismiss them quietly. What shocked Alyssa most wasn't the condescension. It was the ease with which it was delivered. Karen didn't see herself as the villain. She saw herself as a filter doing what she believed was pragmatic. That night, as Alyssa sat at the edge of her temporary apartment bed, staring at the ceiling fan, spinning slow circles above her, she felt something deeper settle inside her chest. Rage, yes, but also a responsibility. Her mission had started as a challenge from her father. It had now evolved into a war for the company's conscience. She wasn't just documenting abuse, she was uncovering a systemic betrayal of values, the kind that couldn't be fixed with policy updates or PR campaigns. It needed structural change, and she would lead it. But first, she would finish her descent. She would go all the way to the basement of Carter Dynamics culture, because only by understanding every broken beam could she rebuild the foundation and make sure no one else ever had to clean up abuse and be told to be grateful for it. It happened on a Friday night, quiet, almost clinical in its violence. The 38th floor conference room was awash in soft, sterile light, the kind meant to foster innovation, but now playing witness to something far more primal. Alyssa Carter, still disguised as Jamie the cleaner, had arrived early to sanitize the space. According to the facility's schedule, the room was blocked off for cleaning from 9:00 p.m. onward. That schedule had been signed off by operations and circulated by internal email. She was following protocol, nothing more, nothing less. She hadn't even crossed the threshold when the door swung open and a sharp voice sliced through the stillness. "Excuse me, where do you think you're going?" It was Veronica Blake, the senior vice president of sales. Known across Carter Dynamics for her charisma, her ruthlessness, and her results, she was the kind of executive who could close 8-figure deals before lunch and leave interns trembling by 2 p.m. She stood at the head of the room like a general on a battlefield. Arms crossed, her expression one of unfiltered disgust. Alyssa paused, startled by the aggression. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, keeping her tone respectful. "This room is scheduled for cleaning at 9:00. I can return after your meeting if needed." It was a reasonable statement made with professionalism and clarity, but reason had no place here. Veronica's eyes narrowed as if Alyssa's words had challenged her authority, her worth, her control. "How dare you interrupt me?" she snapped, stepping forward. "Do I look like someone who needs to be told when to use a room by a janitor?" Her voice was loud enough to be heard through the glass walls that lined the conference room, and people in nearby offices began to turn and look, but not to intervene. "I don't have time to explain basic professionalism to someone who scrubs toilets for a living." The words meant to humiliate hung in the air like a slap, and then the slap came for real. Without warning, Veronica raised her hand and struck Alyssa across the face. The sound was sharp and echoed off the glass and metal like a gunshot. Alyssa stumbled back, one hand instinctively reaching for her cleaning cart to steady herself. Her cheek burned, not just from the physical sting, but from the shock, the raw disbelief. In all her years in corporate America, through boardrooms and briefings and business school, no one had ever laid a hand on her. And now, in her own company, while following procedure, she had been assaulted like she was nothing, and no one, not one person watching, said a word. There were witnesses. Junior sales associates froze behind their laptops, eyes wide, lips sealed. Others quickly looked down at their screens, pretending to type. One man adjusted his tie and stared blankly at the floor, pretending he hadn't seen the red mark beginning to form on the cleaner's cheek. It was a moment of collective cowardice, a company-wide silence louder than any shout. Alyssa looked around the room and saw fear, not sympathy. Fear of rocking the boat, fear of speaking up, fear of becoming the next target. It wasn't just Veronica's slap that landed that night. It was the realization that the culture at Carter Dynamics had become so broken, so stratified, that physical assault could occur in a glass-walled room without consequence. She nearly broke character. For a moment her hands clenched, her voice caught in her throat. Her mind raced with 100 ways to drop the act and reveal exactly who she was. But she didn't. With a level of control even she hadn't known she possessed, Alyssa took a slow breath, lowered her eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry, ma'am." Then she began wiping the conference table as if nothing had happened. But inside, something had snapped, not in defeat, but in clarity. This wasn't just about toxic managers or failed HR policies. This was about an entire ecosystem that rewarded cruelty, punished decency, and trained people to survive by staying silent. And as she quietly finished her cleaning, face-burning dignity, battered but intact, Alyssa made a promise to herself, and to every silent witness in that room, this would never happen again. Not on her watch. The night after the slap, Alyssa didn't cry. She didn't pace. She didn't even speak much. She just sat at the edge of her rented mattress, eyes focused on the empty cleaning cart standing in the corner of the room. For 2 weeks, that cart had been a symbol of her invisibility. But now it would become her strongest weapon. The abuse, the silence, the complicity. It was no longer speculation or whispered pain. She had lived it, felt it, worn it like armor. But to change the system, to confront it from within, she needed more than her story. She needed evidence, and so Alyssa Carter, the once invisible janitor, became an investigator, one whose uniform granted her access. No executive badge ever could. The transformation began with subtle modifications. A tiny HD recorder nestled beneath the hand sanitizer bottle, a discreet camera lens the size of a nail head embedded in the upper corner of the cart's clipboard. Her phone, always on silent, doubled as a still-frame device tucked in the folds of her jacket, capturing discarded memos, emails left open, and post-meeting venting sessions that occurred when people assumed the cleaner couldn't hear or didn't matter. She recorded Ethan Clarke's late-night tirades, his micromanagement, his outbursts. She captured Derek Simmons repeatedly making her redo spotless work, even going so far as to spill his own coffee and blame her for the mess. Each incident was logged, time-stamped, geotagged. She became methodical, almost surgical in her approach. But what Alyssa uncovered next shocked even her. Late one night, she overheard Derek whispering to another executive inside his office. The door had been left slightly ajar. "Don't use the company server," he said, scrolling through his phone. "Forward it to my Proton account. I don't want this traced back." The tone was too cautious for office gossip. It was something more. Alyssa lingered, wiping down a nearby surface just long enough to catch fragments of the conversation. Phrases like redirected funds, Q3 bonuses not reported, and worst of all, "I've already spoken to the partners at Stratedge." That was Carter Dynamics' main competitor. Alyssa didn't know everything yet, but she knew enough. This wasn't just cultural decay. It was corporate betrayal. People at the top weren't just mistreating staff, they were actively bleeding the company from the inside out. What followed were some of the most mentally exhausting nights of her life. Alyssa began piecing together the puzzle. She followed paper trails, photographing whiteboard notes in abandoned meeting rooms, empty email drafts left open after late-night meetings, confidential documents tucked inside trash bins without shredding. Some of it was carelessness. Most of it was arrogance. No one ever suspected the cleaner would be the one to bring them down, and Alyssa used that blindness against them. She even managed to intercept a memo revealing that Veronica Blake had been pushing through inflated expense reports for client dinners that never happened. It was all there: abuse of power, financial manipulation, and a network of executives more loyal to each other than to the company itself. But Alyssa didn't just gather files, she built a case, a presentation formatted with the same precision she'd once used for investor briefings. Every video clip was trimmed, dated, and titled. Every quote was sourced. Every dollar misused had a matching document. She created a timeline of abuse, from the moment Ethan first sabotaged her cart to the day Veronica struck her in public. She cross-referenced these moments with patterns in team turnover, budget discrepancies, and employee complaints that had mysteriously disappeared from HR's records. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a comprehensive indictment, not just of a few bad actors, but of a leadership culture that had normalized cruelty, mismanagement, and theft under the guise of performance pressure. And yet, as the folder grew heavier, Alyssa felt something shift inside her. The pain, the rage, it was still there, but now it had shape. Now it had a voice, and soon it would have an audience. She looked at her cart one last time before clocking out that night. Its compartment still stuffed with brushes, gloves, and cleaner, but now, hidden beneath the surface, it also carried the weight of truth. Alyssa knew she couldn't wait much longer. The next step wouldn't just be exposure, it would be confrontation. And when it came, Carter Dynamics wouldn't just see Jamie the janitor, they would see Alyssa Carter, the woman who had watched their empire from the shadows and was ready to tear the rot out from its roots. The sun rose brighter than usual. On the day everything changed. Monday morning, crisp and clear, casting golden reflections across the towering windows of Carter Dynamics. Inside the building, the executive floor buzzed with an unfamiliar tension. An emergency board meeting had been called by Raymond Carter himself, something that hadn't happened in over a decade. Department heads whispered in the hallways. Assistants scrambled to adjust schedules. No one knew the agenda, but the summons had been urgent, and everyone at the top, Ethan, Derek, Karen, and Veronica, had been required to attend. As they filtered into the sleek, walnut-paneled boardroom, not one of them noticed the quiet figure in grey pushing a cleaning cart near the far corner. Jamie the janitor, they thought. Invisible background. Harmless. Alyssa's heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with purpose. She had rehearsed every step, every line. Her mop leaned quietly against the wall, but today it was no longer a prop for disguise. It was a symbol of everything she had seen, absorbed, and endured. She moved along the room's edge just as she had for weeks, cleaning as executives took their seats. At the head of the table stood her father, Raymond Carter, eyes solemn, fingers interlaced. He gave no indication of the storm about to unfold. His gaze swept the room once and briefly met his daughter's. In that glance, Alyssa saw everything: pride, permission, and an unspoken signal. It was time Ethan was the first to snap. "Why is she still in here?" he barked, gesturing toward Alyssa with open disdain. "We're about to discuss confidential material." A few heads nodded. The room turned toward the cleaner, waiting for her to exit. But instead, Alyssa calmly walked to the center of the boardroom, removed her ID badge, and unclipped her headscarf. She unzipped the front of her gray uniform, revealing a crisp navy blazer underneath. Her natural curls framed her face, her posture straightened, and when she removed the oversized glasses and replaced them with her real ones, the realization spread through the room like a shockwave. Mouths opened, chairs shifted, silence fell heavy. Then, with a calm, clear voice, she spoke. "Actually, I'd like to stay." She turned first to Ethan. "I think you'll want to hear what I have to say." Ethan, she used his name intentionally, casually, like an equal, no longer the woman who mopped his floors, no longer the invisible one. "My name is Alyssa Carter, and I've spent the last 2 weeks working in this building, not as a vice president, not as your colleague, but as the person most of you don't even see." A beat passed. She stepped forward and retrieved a remote from the inside pocket of her blazer. "What I'm about to show you," she said. "Pressing the button is what this company has become beneath the surface." The monitor behind her flickered to life. The first video played without sound, just the timestamp, the hallway, and the unmistakable image of Ethan Clarke pouring water over her head. The boardroom collectively inhaled, Ethan's face drained of color. "That's taken out of context," he said weakly. She was being insubordinate. "There is no context," Alyssa cut in. "No circumstance where humiliating an employee is acceptable." The next clip rolled, Derek Simmons belittling her, making her clean the same surface over and over. Then Karen Monroe nodding along while calmly dismissing her abuse report. "Roles like yours have different expectations," Karen's voice echoed. Murmurs rippled across the room. And finally, Veronica Blake, hand raised in mid-strike, the slap caught from 2 angles. Audio included. "You are nothing here," Veronica's voice hissed. And now no one could pretend otherwise. Alyssa stepped back as the final slide came up an internal audit trail linking Derek and Veronica to embezzled funds and messages showing attempts to funnel sensitive data to Carter Dynamics' top competitor. The evidence was clear. It was organized. It was damning. As she let the silence hang, her voice softened but never lost its strength. "This isn't about revenge," she said. "It's about accountability. About remembering what this company was built to stand for and who it has failed. My father didn't create Carter Dynamics to become a playground for cruelty. He built it on the belief that innovation comes from integrity. Somewhere along the way, we lost that, but today, that ends." No one interrupted. No one moved. And for the first time in weeks, Alyssa Carter was truly seen, not just by her abusers, not just by the board, but by the company. Her disguise had fallen away, but the strength beneath it had been there all along. And as Raymond stood beside her, placing one firm hand on her shoulder, Alyssa didn't feel victorious. She felt ready, because the truth was out, and now the real work could begin. For a moment, no one spoke. The air inside the boardroom felt frozen in time, suspended between what had just been revealed and what needed to come next. The weight of Alyssa's words, the power of the footage, and the undeniable betrayal echoed in the silence. 4 faces sat stunned at the long, polished table: Ethan Clark, Derek Simmons, Karen Monroe, and Veronica Blake, each of them stripped of their authority not by force, but by the undeniable truth they'd spent years believing would never surface. And at the head of the table stood Raymond Carter, eyes dark with both heartbreak and conviction. He had built this company from his garage, brick by brick, code by code. And now he was watching part of it crumble so that something better could be rebuilt. He took a breath, then spoke. "What we've seen today is not a few isolated mistakes," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "This is a pattern, a culture that has grown in the shadows while we celebrated our image in the spotlight." His voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. It carried the full authority of a founder who was no longer asking for improvement. He was demanding change. As of this moment, Raymond continued turning toward the stunned executives. Ethan Clark, Karen Monroe, Derek Simmons, and Veronica Blake are terminated from their positions. Effective immediately. Security will assist you in collecting your belongings and escorting you from the premises. Veronica flinched as if slapped again. Derek muttered something under his breath. Maybe a denial, maybe a plea, but no one acknowledged him. Karen's polished calm cracked her face. Pale, Ethan clenched his jaw and stood shoulders rigid, but his eyes betrayed the fear he never thought he'd feel. The guards entered the room quietly, professionally, already briefed and ready. "You can't be serious," Ethan hissed, refusing to meet Alyssa's gaze. "After everything I've done for this company," Raymond didn't look away. "That's exactly why I'm serious," he replied, "because with power comes responsibility, and none of you used yours with integrity." The 4 executives rose one by one, the quiet shuffling of chairs. The only sound as their downfall was witnessed by the very institution they thought they controlled. When the doors finally closed behind them, the board remained silent until Raymond placed both hands on the table. "Let me be clear," he said. "This isn't about Alyssa's return. This is about the values we've lost and the leadership we now need." He turned to his daughter standing beside him. "Alyssa Carter is the future of Carter Dynamics, not because she's my daughter, but because she's just proven herself in a way no title, degree, or resume ever could. She saw what we couldn't or wouldn't, and she stayed in the fire long enough to bring the truth to light." He stepped aside as Alyssa faced the room again. No longer in disguise, no longer a supporting player. This was her stage now, and she didn't need to ask for their attention. They gave it freely. "I'm not here to fix this overnight." Alyssa began, her voice steady but heartfelt. "I'm here to start something new, not a rebrand, not a PR campaign, a reckoning. Because culture isn't what you write in a handbook, it's what happens when no one's watching." She outlined her immediate plan: a third-party audit of all departments, the creation of a true employee feedback system with whistleblower protections, and a complete restructuring of HR to eliminate internal bias. More importantly, she declared a company-wide reset, starting with the people who had been overlooked the most. "From this day forward," she said, "we will see our janitors the same way we see our directors. We will hear the quiet voices first. We will reward character over compliance." By the time the meeting ended, something had shifted in the room and in the hearts of those still sitting there. No applause was needed, no dramatic music, just a shared sense that something real had happened. A wrong had been named, a line had been drawn, and Carter Dynamics was no longer just a company with a legacy. It was a company with a future, one rooted not in performance alone, but in principle. Alyssa stayed behind as the board members filed out. Her father lingered at her side, pride glowing softly behind the weariness in his eyes. "You didn't just change this company," he said quietly. "You reminded it what it was meant to be." Alyssa nodded already, thinking of the next steps, the harder conversations, the rebuilding ahead, because the reckoning had come, and now it was time to rise from it. 6 months had passed since that unforgettable Monday, the day truth took the head seat at the Carter Dynamics boardroom table, and silence was no longer an acceptable currency. From the outside, the company still gleamed its glass facade, still caught the morning sun. Its press releases still made headlines. But inside, something real had shifted. The air felt lighter. The halls, once echoing with anxiety and unspoken hierarchy, now carried the sound of casual conversation, spontaneous laughter, and the quiet energy of people who finally felt like they belonged. No one called it a culture change initiative. No memo had been sent about a rebrand. The transformation had come from something deeper: leadership that listened and a promise that was kept. Alyssa Carter, now officially CEO, had never returned to her office in the same way. Her name was on the door, yes, but she rarely spent a full day behind it. She walked the floors, she visited every department, shook every hand, and learned first names that had never made it into reports. She ate lunch with maintenance staff, just as often as with analysts. She set a new tradition once a month, a reverse Q&A, where executives were required to listen while frontline employees asked the questions. And when someone spoke, she didn't interrupt. She didn't scan her phone. She listened like their words were policy, which more often than not, they became. People no longer whispered their frustrations into break-room corners. They voiced them, and they were heard. The results weren't just emotional, they were measurable. Turnover among hourly staff dropped by 42%. Job satisfaction scores, once middling and guarded, now reflected pride and purpose. Diversity in leadership roles rose not because of quotas, but because talent that had been overlooked for years was finally being cultivated. Karen Monroe's replacement, a former office manager from the support staff, redesigned the HR system to be employee-led, anonymous, and fully transparent. Cleaning crews were now salaried. Interns had mentorship programs led by multiple departments, not just left to sink or swim. Promotions were tied not just to output, but to collaboration and ethical leadership. What had once been a culture of fear had become a place of shared ownership. But more importantly, people no longer looked over their shoulders. They walked into work without the tension of wondering if they would be respected or discarded. One engineer quietly told Alyssa during a surprise visit, "This place feels human now," and that perhaps was the highest praise she could have received. Alyssa never announced herself with grand gestures. She didn't flood social media with speeches. Instead, she rebuilt the company with the same humility she'd had when pushing that mop cart. One hallway, one policy, one conversation at a time. Her leadership came not from her title, but from her journey, the memory of what it felt like to be invisible in a company that now saw everyone. Raymond Carter, now retired and finally embracing rest, often visited his daughter not to advise, but to watch. One afternoon he stood in the atrium and observed employees from every floor gathering for a team forum that Alyssa had introduced. He watched as a young woman from IT, a first-generation college graduate, led the discussion with ease and confidence. He turned to Alyssa and asked, "Do you ever miss the old company?" She smiled. "I don't," she said. "Because what we have now, this is the company you dreamed of. I just had to go to the bottom to bring it back to life." And her father, eyes a little misty, nodded in agreement. Carter Dynamics wasn't perfect. Mistakes still happened. Challenges still came. But the difference now was how they were faced together, openly, with integrity. The cleaner's uniform that Alyssa had once worn was now folded neatly in a shadow box frame in her office, not as a symbol of shame, but of pride. It reminded her daily that leadership isn't about who has the corner office, but who's willing to fight for the corners no one sees. And as she stood before a new group of hires one morning, she didn't talk about KPIs or market growth. She told them a story about empathy, about resilience, about how she learned to lead by becoming the person no one noticed. And by the time she finished, no one in the room could ever forget who she was or what Carter dynamics had become. Under her care, a company rebuilt from the inside out, with courage, compassion, and eyes wide open. If this story moved you, we invite you to reflect on what real leadership means in your own world. At Deep Inside HQ, we bring you powerful stories of courage, accountability, and transformation. Stories that challenge systems and elevate the quiet heroes among us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next chapter. Join our growing community and help us continue uncovering the truths hidden in plain sight. Your voice matters, your view matters. Let's go deeper together.